Philosophy of mind has long been haunted by a single distinction: the difference between simulation and understanding. A machine might reproduce the outward structure of reasoning. It might imitate the steps, the outputs, the surface behavior. But does it actually understand what it's doing? For centuries, this question was often framed in metaphysical language. Some philosophers spoke of a space of reasons, a domain where meanings and justifications live, separate from the brute mechanics of nature. Others spoke of consciousness as something irreducible, a property that machines could never possess. Alexander Lerchner's recent work is interesting precisely because he avoids these moves. His argument does not Physical systems evolve through continuous dynamics. To treat those dynamics as computation, we must divide them into discrete states. We must alphabetize the physical flow of events. Only once the system is partitioned into symbols, transitions, and meanings can we call it computation. And according to Lerchner, this alphabetization requires something specific. It requires experience, not experience in a naive mechanical sense as data absorption, but as the categories or conceptual schemes that interpret it and give it meaning. So what a computation requires to count as computation is a subject capable of extracting concepts from lived interaction with the world. In Lerchner's view, symbols alone are not enough. They are merely vehicles, physical tokens. Without experience grounding the concepts they represent, the system remains fundamentally blind. It may simulate reasoning perfectly, but the meaning of what it manipulates would always come from somewhere else, from the human mapmaker. Now I think that there are at least two places where such a boundary might appear. The first possibility is nonsense detection. One must be able to tell when something is mere machine-produced nonsense, even if it appears perfectly coherent. How is that supposed to be made? One might imagine something like interpreting angels as abstract entities, only to discover, centuries later, that the system has gradually reclassified demons as the same thing. Perhaps this happened because the machine learned the concept angel through internet quotations rather than through the long traditions of religious texts. Or perhaps its learning pathway simply diverged from the biological rules through which human beings historically acquired the concept. We tend to assume that cognition has a default mode, successful cognition. The folk picture says thinking is designed to reach truth, as if the mind contained a reliable mechanism that separates truth from falsehood every time. From this intuition, a familiar philosophical trajectory emerges. Observe thinking,
try to grasp its essence, treat epistemic success as the standard, and assume that failure is just a breakdown of that one process. So, cognition leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to metaphysics. The world is what true cognition reveals. But skepticism begins by questioning that assumption. There is no single form of cognitive failure. What counts as failure shifts with the ways cognition is mediated by language, culture, tools, practices. A method that produces reliable beliefs in one framework may become opaque in another. At the level of translation, prediction already breaks down. Some philosophers push further. Hilary Putnam, for example, argued that the very same cognitive architecture can generate incompatible yet internally coherent descriptions of the world. In other words, uniform cognition does not guarantee a single reality. So the lesson is not that cognition fails, but that it has no sacred default. Like morality, it is historically shaped, adjustable, and open to redistribution across tools and institutions. Thinking can be scaffolded, extended, even partially outsourced, without ceasing to be thinking. And if that is true, then the arrival of new cognitive mediators does not destroy cognition. It reveals that cognition was never pure, solitary, or fixed to begin with.
Suppose you are a cognitive scientist. The first and simplest task seems obvious. Determine what you study, cognition. You begin by asking what distinguishes cognition from non-cognition, and the natural answer is success. Cognition is information processing that works, that reliably produces true beliefs, effective action, adaptive behavior. So you look to epistemic practices that avoid pathology, delusion, systematic error, breakdown. From this, you extract a baseline of normality, what counts as a properly functioning cognizing agent. But the terrain is far less stable than it appears. Imagine trying to define successful cognition for an organism, tracking food, danger, opportunity, structure. You observe reliable repetition, rational updating, feedback sensitivity. Everything looks robust, and yet no amount of successful repetition guarantees stability of reference. A population could converge on tracking a proxy reference, something systematically correlated with the target but not identical to it. This example is tragic because if even the individuation of a reliable tracking mechanism is not immune to drift for tracking singular things like food, so imagine how unstable the individuation becomes for richer, second-order cognition, cognizing theoretical entities, laws, and explanatory relations. To feel the tragedy, try to answer this skeptical exercise. Was Newton cognizing the same thing we cognize when we speak of gravity? And if you could transplant Newton's very process of thought into a modern agent, would it still latch onto the same target? Or would the surrounding web of concepts, norms, and success conditions silently redirect what counts as the object of cognition? What determines the truth about what someone believes? I mean, how could a psychologist claim that is not what he truly believes when someone is hiding something? The conventional answer is that to attribute a belief is not to quote a sentence. It is to posit a stable internal state that best explains a person's behavior across contexts. A single statement is weak evidence. A pattern is strong evidence. If someone insists they are not afraid but avoids the elevator every day, hesitates at the door, sweats when it opens, and invents reasons to take the stairs, well then the disagreement is no longer about words. It is about which model explains the total evidence. This is why the truth condition, where Carnap formalizes the rational relation among propositions, Fodor posits an internal representational system that makes such relations psychologically real.
In this passage, he suggests that many mentalist metaphors, the ones designed to specify a unified internal mechanism of thought, are more conventional than we like to admit.
So Rorty is convincing at a crucial point. Even if we succeed in specifying an internal syntax that gives a better explanation of a trajectory of thought, a question immediately follows. Should we go further and treat that description as a template for how a healthy mind ought to look? Should depart?
Rorty's warning is subtle but far-reaching. Once we stop treating cognitive mechanisms as hidden sources of authority, the idea of a privileged inner route to truth begins to dissolve. Descriptions of how minds work no longer guarantee norms for how thought ought to proceed. What remains is not a purified core of representation, but a shifting set of vocabularies, practices, and purposes through which we make ourselves intelligible to one another. If that is right, then knowledge cannot be explained as the output of an internal faculty designed to mirror reality. The very framework of representationalism, the idea that truth originates inside the subject, becomes suspect. To understand cognition differently, we may have to relocate the source of form itself, moving it outside the individual mind and into the shared structures that make meaning possible at all.
Human knowledge does not begin in clarity. It begins in opacity. What we call understanding is not the elimination of this opacity, but its stabilization through shared forms of life.
We thought machines would need minds like ours to understand us. Instead, they learned to operate in the space between us, not inside a consciousness, but inside the patterns that make meaning possible at all. AI does not think like a human. It operates at the level where humans become intelligible to one another, not by grasping some inner essence of representation, but by exploiting the points where our practices intersect. At those intersections, we can predict behavior, reduce the opacity of others to familiar psychological patterns, and, in a further normative step, to shared standards of knowledge. What sits at the peak of scientific understanding tends to converge with the common sense expectations we apply to those around us. In that sense, artificial intelligence does not introduce a new form of thinking. It reveals what human thinking always depended on.
AI misalignment is not a futuristic anomaly. It is an intensified version of a familiar pattern. Systems converging on functional success while drifting away from the normative space in which responsibility still makes sense. A system that delivers optimized outcomes while suppressing mediation erases its own genealogy. And what is lost in that erasure is not meaning in a mystical sense, but accountability, correction, and shared judgment. This series defends that thesis while revisiting a line of continental diagnosis that, in retrospect, appears almost prophetic. For Martin For Hegel, distortion does not begin with conflict. It begins when mediation disappears. Immediacy feels powerful because it is fast and unquestionable. But it conceals how norms are produced, how authority stabilizes itself, and how alternatives were excluded. Mediation, by contrast, exposes the work, the labor, tension, and transformation through which norms become binding. Human history is full of non-conscious systems that became autonomous relative to the people inside them. Bureaucracies, markets, legal frameworks, technical infrastructures. It is their Over time, this does more than erase perspectives. It erases the process of tension that once produced the solution to a problem. The plurality of forces, cultural, historical, normative, that pushed in different directions, is compressed into a single convergent outcome. The result works, the system succeeds, performance improves. But the conflict that made mediation necessary no longer appears anywhere. What remains is efficiency without genealogy. The central worry is misalignment, the possibility that highly capable systems may operate in ways that are perfectly effective, internally coherent, and even beneficial by many metrics, while remaining indifferent to the values, priorities, and forms of life that originally gave rise to them. Not hostile, not malicious, just unresponsive to what matters. What matters here is not whether this will happen, it is why this fear feels so familiar. A similar anxiety already shaped philosophy during German Idealism and early Romantic thought. At that time, Europe was undergoing intense processes of cultural, institutional, and legal standardization. Languages, norms, and systems of regulation were expanding across different peoples and traditions. Many feared a growing gap between how a society actually lived and negotiated meaning, and how systems attempted to absorb and regulate it. This becomes especially clear in the case of law. Legal systems are meant to mediate social tensions. But when they lose contact with the plurality of forces they are supposed to regulate, they begin to speak a foreign vocabulary. Rules and procedures remain valid, coherent, and enforceable, yet no longer translate the real negotiations taking place within a society.